I call the channel the Jungle Nook. I was just getting ready to up pot a few plants. I figured I'll grab the camera. It's a good opportunity to finally share with you is a really effective and simple potting mix that's cost effective that you can make at home yourself. Really, you can do it with as little as 2 different ingredients. I'll get into the maintenance and fertilizing and also give some other relevant information or information that you might just find interesting in this video.
So the two products that we're going to use, actually the first one, it's either going to be peat moss or coco coir. And when trying to figure out which one's best for your needs, really the determining factor in that's going to be where you live. For me, I live in the United States. So if you live in the United States or Canada, really peat moss is probably the best option. It will be the easiest to find and it will be cheaper for us compared to coco coir because it's harvested primarily in Canada. But if you live maybe in Asia or Europe, then coco coir will most likely be what you'll be using for cost and availability. But really, peat moss and coco coir, no matter where you live or what type of plant you're using it for, it serves the same purpose. Peat moss and coco coir are both organic, but when they break down, they really don't break down quickly. So you don't lose any kind of real volume out of your pot. It takes so long for them to break down. But neither of these products, when they break down, do they release or are they converted into any kind of real significant amounts of nutrient. What peat moss and coco coir do is they provide a nice fluffy medium for the roots to be able to grow through, but it's actually like a sponge. It is what absorbs the moisture. Peat moss and coco coir absorb a lot of moisture and can hold on to it for a long time, as well as nutrients. That's what peat moss and coco coir are doing. And one of those two products will primarily be what the potting mix will be made out of. And to that, we will add perlite. And that is for aeration and drainage. Plants do require oxygen, in with the root structure and with the root system. They do require that for strong, healthy roots and a strong, healthy plant. But it's also great for drainage. And the more you add to it, the faster the soil's going to dry out, which is great when dealing with things like cacti or succulents. Things more like tropical varieties, ferns, things like that like moisture soil. You just put a little less perlite into the soil mix. When you purchase a bag of pre-made potting mix, it's going to be comprised of either peat moss and coco coir, but also forest byproducts. And really what they mean by that, it's basically sawdust, the leftover wood product that gets ground up from lumber mills. They sell that, and that's the forest byproduct in most cases. And the thing about that is not all materials, when they decompose, do they decompose into all of the nutrients that you need. You really want your compost or organic material, if you're adding that to a pot, to be comprised from many different sources of organics. So you get a variety of different types of nutrients as it decomposes. Something else to be aware of if you're using, like a real rich organic compost or manure, is that the smaller, finer pieces are going to break down and be converted into nutrients pretty rapidly. Usually within about 6 months to a year, they're pretty much all used up. And you'll have to re-amend the soil with these types of products to not only replace that volume of soil that you lost, but to, replenish the organics if that's what you're relying on for nutrients. And over time, you'll notice there's actually less volume of soil. That's because all the good, rich organics are breaking down and being consumed by the microorganisms in the soil into nutrients. Once those products are all used up, you do have to replenish them. Or, you got to be adding some sort of a liquid or slow release fertilizer to ensure the plant continues to have the nutrients that it needs so that it can be healthy. over time, after about maybe 6 months to a year, really what you're left with is either just the peat moss or coco coir, or any of the larger pieces of organic material, maybe wood chips or bark, which, you know, those materials really don't release a wide spectrum of nutrients. When you're buying a potting mix that's already made and they're telling you that the plants will grow, you know, twice as fast, or you'll get more flowers or whatever compared to other brands, really what they've done is they've taken the peat moss or coco coir, added some wood product to it, and maybe some slow release fertilizers, and they'll grow a plant out of that, and then they'll also put the same type of plant into just peat moss or coco coir, and then they'll compare how those plants perform in the two different products. Well, yeah, the one with the added nutrients and some added organics is going to do better because it's got nutrients as opposed to just peat moss or coco coir. I mean, they're not lying to you. Their product really is going to grow the plants better compared to just in peat moss or coco coir. But you can get the exact same results and reduce the amount of maintenance you have to do to your pot over time with the mix I'm about to show you. And it will be cheaper. Like I said, I have two different plants here that we will be up-potting, and they both do have slightly different requirements for the soil. This one here likes the soil to dry out in between waterings, and this guy right here prefers to be in a more moist soil, likes the soil to stay moist. But first, I want to explain why this mix we're making up is cost effective, why it's cheap. So I have a bale, I know it's upside down, I have a bale right here of, it's just peat moss, it's compressed peat moss. It is 2.2 cubic feet, but when you fluff this up, it will equal 4.4 cubic feet when it's all fluffed up. I only paid $16 for this bale compared to one of these bags of your leading potting mixes that's already mixed up. Here I just happen to be using Miracle-Gro potting mix. It is a great potting mix, but this bag, which also cost me $16, is only about, it's not even a full 2 cubic feet. So even if I had 2 bags of this and now I've spent $36, I still don't have as much volume as what I got out of this bale for $16. More than a 50% savings. Now, also in this bag here, it's about 50% forest byproduct. You know, that's going to break down. I will probably lose maybe 10-15% of the overall volume when those other organics that they've added to this bag here break down. And there's some slow release fertilizer and a real little bit of perlite too. But eventually that fertilizer, you know, between the organics and the slow release, it's all going to be used up. And over here, all of the material that's in this bag pretty much will still be in our pots. Now over here, this large bag is actually vermiculite. It's not perlite. I just got the bag here to show you the size, because this is 4 cubic feet. And you can buy a bulk bag of perlite that's 4 cubic feet for about $50. What I have on hand here is this smaller bag of perlite right here. And I paid between $7 to $8 for this bag. This small bag only has 8 quarts in it, whereas 4 cubic feet, that's 120 quarts. So I'm only paying 40 cents a quart compared to 85 cents a quart in this smaller bag. Buying in bulk and buying just the individual material really does pay off. More than a 50% savings here, more than a 50% savings over here. Plus this material's not going to break down, and then I won't have to add more volume later as it decomposes. For most of my tropical varieties, things like Monstera, Philodendron, Pothos, things like that. Put about 30% perlite into my peat moss or coco coir mix. So for 10 scoops of this peat moss right here, I will put in 3 scoops of perlite for most of my tropical varieties, and that will give me about 30%. For this first plant that I'm going to be planting up, I know that it likes to be kept in moister soil than your average tropical variety that I just mentioned. So I'm going to add a little bit less perlite. I'm only going to put 2 scoops in. Now the perlite's great for providing aeration as well as to help the soil drain. But it's also really good for compaction. Now peat moss and coco coir is really not going to compact. Those are true organics that will cause that. And what I mean by true organics, what I think of as true organics, is a real rich compost or a well-aged manure. A rich compost is something that was made up of a variety of different types of organic material. So it will break down into a broader spectrum of nutrients and minerals. When you're using manure, you want to use a well-aged manure so that the nutrients aren't so intense that it could burn your plant. If you're buying bagged manure, it's most likely a very well-aged manure. But you got to know how much to put in, and it's kind of a guessing game because you don't know how rich that organic material is or how much really to put in. Like right here, I put in 10 scoops. I wouldn't put in 1 scoop of manure or compost and think that that's going to feed my plant for 6 months to a year. You got to find the right ratio, but you don't want to put too much in because it's those types of organics, those are the type of materials that will compact over time in a pot. That's why peat moss and coco coir is great. It doesn't compact. And this would be fine for that potting mix. But because I know this plant really does like to be nice and moist, and I do have some vermiculite, I know I said just 2 products, but I have it here. So I'm going to add a scoop of vermiculite in too. Vermiculite does everything that perlite does, except it will actually hold onto and retain moisture even longer. I got it here, so I'm going to use it. But I really didn't even need to put this in. Would have been just fine. So that's the potting mix. I'm using peat moss and perlite. And that's all I really needed. But yes, I did put a little bit of vermiculite in as well. But there's no nutrients really in this at all. And what I will be doing is using a all-purpose liquid fertilizer. About once a month I will fertilize as directed off of the fertilizer I'm using, but it's an all-purpose fertilizer. I'm also going to put in some slow release fertilizer. This is Osmocote Plus. It's also a all-purpose fertilizer. And I'm going to add some of this in there because this is like an insurance policy for me. Making sure that it, just in case I forget to fertilize, it's still got something. It's just a little bit of an insurance policy. This alone in this type of a potting mix is not enough. Great idea to add some of this into it as directed, but it's not going to meet all of the needs. You know, within 4 to 6 months, it's depleted anyway. Every season I add some more of this into my pots. But I will be using a liquid fertilizer once a month. You know what I just put in here, and the liquid fertilizer is how the plant's getting its nutrients, as opposed to through real true organics or a real rich soil. But if I knew I was going to be fertilizing faithfully, I wouldn't have even needed to add that slow release fertilizer in here. This pot has drainage. It's real important. All of your pots should always have drainage so that as you water, the excess water can drain through the soil and out of the pot. It's really, really important. You don't want to skip that and put it in a pot with no drainage. You can get root rot and all sorts of different problems and pests because of that. Now this plant is in a pot with no drainage. And you can see I haven't even watered this in like 2 days, and some water came out. It's really not a good situation for this plant. I've had it for a while though, but we're going to be up-potting it today. The roots look good. I would have liked for the roots to have filled out in here a little bit more, but this does need to get up-potted into a more suitable pot. It likes to be in well-draining, moist soil. When you hear the term moist, that is when you would, like say, take a sponge and submerge it in the water. You take it out, you wring it out the best you can. You cannot get no more water out of that sponge, but the sponge is still moist. That's the level at which I want to always keep this plant, just like almost all of my tropical varieties. If the soil needs to remain moist, you do not want to let it overly dry out, even in between waterings. They don't mean bone dry. So the fertilizing every month with the liquid fertilizer, that's part of the maintenance. Also, if you're adding slow release fertilizers about every 4 to 6 months, that's also part of the maintenance. But another part is worm castings. I add worm castings every time I add more of the slow release fertilizer, because you're supposed to work this stuff into the soil. So I'll just sprinkle some on top, and then I'll add some right on top of the soil. I do this for a variety of reasons. One, I really like the black color, but also it acts as a buffer for soil pH. It will help to keep your soil pH neutral, which is what most plants prefer. It will either raise or lower the soil pH a little bit to keep it neutral. It does other things as well. It does add a little bit of nitrogen into the soil. Not much, but nitrogen is great. And it does provide some true organics a little bit into the potting mix to help keep a nice colony of microorganisms. Now, using a liquid fertilizer, the nutrients already are small enough so that the water can absorb the nutrients that's within the soil, within the peat moss or coco coir. So we're not really relying on microorganisms to break down organics to fertilize the plant. But it's still good for those microorganisms, because microorganisms do not just break nutrients down. Some of the microorganisms in the soil also help to transfer nutrients to the roots. So because I want a neutral pH for this plant right here, I know this is going to help to ensure that it's going to give a little bit of nitrogen, not much, but it's also going to help with the microorganisms. The real big reason I'm putting this in here for me is to control the soil pH, to keep it neutral for this plant. I got a whole video on soil pH. I also have a video that is on perlite and vermiculite and the benefits of using them and what the real difference is between the two products. Both vermiculite and perlite are great products to amend your soil with. This might seem like a lot of water. I'm just gonna let this soak in and we'll see if any of it even comes out of the bottom. So it's been about a half hour and no water came out of the bottom, even with how much I put in. So I'm going to water it again, and I'm going to continue to do this once every half hour until I see water coming out of the bottom of this pot, to ensure that all of that peat moss that's in there is thoroughly hydrated and that there's no dry pockets. Now I already mixed up some peat moss and some of that slow release fertilizer already. Now, because this plant does like to completely dry out in between waterings, it does not like to stay real moist. What I did is I put 4 scoops of peat moss in here, and now I'm going to put 2 scoops of the perlite, so it will be a more well-draining, a faster draining soil mix. And I will be letting this plant dry out completely, almost completely, in between waterings. And again, this pot does have drainage and its own little tray to drain out. This pot also has no drainage. It's awful wet in there. Not smelling any kind of a swampy smell, but the roots are quite crumbly. This plant really did need to get up potted into a pot with drainage and soil with better drainage as well. And a little bit of the worm castings. So this plant right here, it does have water starting to come out of the bottom. So I'm not going to water it for a few days. But this one, I only watered it the one time, and there's no water coming out of the bottom of the pot yet. But because of the type of plant that it is, it's a succulent. I'm going to wait at least a week, maybe even 2 weeks before I add any more water to this plant. So I hope the video was helpful. Leave me a comment, hit the like button, and if you haven't already, please subscribe.